Sharon. Thank you very much for coming. And for those of you, where's the camera? Laura, where's the camera? And for those of you tuning in at home, thank you also for tuning in. I know there's a lot of online excitement about this lecture. So people from New Jersey to Florence and back are tuning in right now to listen to us, and especially to listen to our guest, Sharon Gerstel. Sharon is the acting and I think also the founding director of the Stavros Niarchos Center for Hellenic Culture at UCLA. I think it was only a few months ago that you received a $5 million grant to start the project from the Niarchos Foundation. And that's a great achievement for Byzantine studies in general and for UCLA as well, and for California. Sharon holds a degree from the IFA, and she taught at University of Maryland before coming to UCLA. She held numerous awards from Dumbarton Oaks, Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American School for Classical Studies. I first met Sharon at the BSc conference in Baltimore in 2004. And since then, I had the pleasure of reading many of her work. Herb Kessler, my advisor, made me read your entire Beholding Sacred Mysteries, which is Sharon's first book. And I especially remember the chapter on the Apostolic Embrace, which I think until this very day is basically the only thing ever written on this thing, and it's just a remarkable iconographical motif. Her recent book, which led me to believe that she's the best speaker for tonight's lecture, is entitled Rural Lives and Landscapes in Late Byzantium, Art, Archaeology, and Ethnography. It was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015, and it was awarded the Runciman Prize of 2016, the inaugural prize of the International Center of Medieval Art in 2016 as well, and the Maria Theokaris Prize from the Christian Archaeological Society in Greece in 2017. This is a unique book because it deals not just with medieval art, architecture, and material culture, but also because it uses anthropological and ethnographical models to study a set of churches and chapels that are accompanied with no liturgical documentation, and much of the research was done, I guess, in what are now domestic settings, where some of the chapels were actually converted into stables. And I remember one very remarkable image of a now stable, formerly known as a chapel, that is part of your study. Therefore, the book is a rare combination of medieval art research and more than 20 years of field work, studying and researching churches in medieval village settings. One of the guiding clues in Sharon's research are dedicatory inscriptions, which she uses beautifully to tell the stories of rural buildings, art, and most important, people, or rural people, if you will. These dedicatory inscriptions made by common folks are so similar to those objects displayed in our galleries at 18 West at the exhibition Agents of Faith, so showing similar agricultural concerns, dreams, and anxieties. And so on top of the many other reasons that I had to invite Sharon to join us this evening, in light of our shared interest in dedication and in rural lives and folkloristic devotion, I think Sharon is the best person to be our guest in our comparative studies of medieval and Islamic and Asian material culture of the Middle Ages, and therefore she's our guest this evening. Her lecture is titled Art and Devotional Practices in the Byzantine Village, The Long View. Let us please welcome Sharon.
Thank you, Itai. I'm so thrilled to be here this evening. First, because I get to not drive around LA for 3 hours, taking my child here, there, and yon. But second, I was able to see this fantastic exhibition, and I want to say I love the exhibition. And you're absolutely right; it resonated with me, and it's something I wish I could bring my students to, maybe virtually. if you can indulge me for 1 second, I just also want to speak to the people who are following this lecture, because I know there are many people from Greece and from the region that we'll see who are tuning in from Greece. So just give me 1 second. Ήθελα να σας ευχαριστήσω θερμά για την υποστήριξη, και αυτή η ομιλία είναι μια αφιέρωση στις κοινότητες της Ημάνης που προσπαθούν πάρα πολύ να φτιάξουν αυτά τα μνημεία και να δώσουν αγάπη και στα κτίρια που θα παρουσιάσω σήμερα το βράδυ. Okay, so translation to come. So until recently, μεταξύ αναπληρώτη, and I just want to make sure because I have a film that should be showing right now. I don't know if we're connected to where we're supposed to be. It's not. Let's have one technical moment to just stop and connect. I think it was turned off a moment ago when the power was connected to the other room. Should be able to click on here and the film starts. I think something was turned off here. Yeah. Sure. Let me just. Yeah, okay, I'll do the play button that way. The old-fashioned way. Okay. Until recently, Medaxia Anaplioti, who will come up at some point here. Yeah. I'm going to wait a second because I think it's important that you see her. I don't know. Is it connected in the back now when it wasn't before? Is that possible? Yeah. Can she turn it on? Okay. Let me try and just reconnect it and see if that does it. We all know this is the art historian's nightmare. Try again. Okay, until recently, Metaxia Anaplioti, a resident of the village of Vamvaka in the Mani, the southernmost peninsula of the Peloponnese, entered the Byzantine church of Ai Theodori every afternoon to light a candle in fulfillment of a vow. At the age of 30, Metaxia had been severely injured in an accident crippling her legs. The vow she made, if she were to recover her ability to walk, was to the two holy Theodores, the titular saints of the church, standing 100 feet from her ancestral home, the church of her family, and of other families in Vamvaka. And thus, because of her love of this church, she was entrusted by the Greek Ministry of Culture to serve as its caretaker. She alone held the key to the building, and she alone unlocked the door, both for those who came to pray and for those who came to photograph. And it was in her role as protector of the church of Ai Theodori that I first met her in the summer of 2016, when I, having recently lost my father, asked her to light a candle in his memory for each of 40 days. And she readily agreed to this request, and thus Metaxia lit candles for my father, adding my memories to her memories, my vow to her vow. For the last 25 years, my research has largely focused on this isolated region of Greece, where medieval churches like Metaxia's, sometimes 3 or 4 in a village, served as agents of faith, like the objects in the exhibition that were meant to be held or the votive paintings that were intended to capture and convey prayer. Too often, such churches, the offerings of extended families and small communities, have been cast aside by scholars in favor of monuments built by the elite. But this evening, and stimulated by the Bard exhibition, I would like to use the Church of Ai Theodori to think about how such buildings and their decoration functioned over time. The issues that surround the construction of churches like this one, after all, are universal. How buildings served and continue to serve as containers of memory, how they fall within the intersecting circles of the liturgical calendar, the agricultural cycle, the passage of life cycle rituals, how the bodies of celebrants and supplicants move through consecrated space, and how the buildings epigraphically and acoustically record and shape words and sounds. Beholding the church's decoration and experiencing its architecture, the mind harvests the rich world of nature and touches the realm of heaven. Through the agency of the church, human time is transcended. We are linked to our past, and generations of the faithful, both living and dead, are collected in common and eternal prayer. My current research looks at the Mani over time, from the peninsula's most ancient settlements to villages of the modern period, a period especially in a time of economic crisis in which depopulation and neglect has left many Byzantine churches like this one empty and in disrepair. According to an inscription in the building, Ai Theodori was dedicated in the month of August in the Byzantine year 6583, 1075 according to our accounting system. The church is built of stone, some freshly quarried for the purpose, and some brought by the community from elsewhere for the construction. Stone has a special resonance for the people who live in this rocky peninsula. It is the material of life. It is the material of houses, churches, graves, cisterns, and all other built features. Within this church, stone yields to nature as it is shaped into the forms of plants and animals. And it nourishes life as plants penetrate the masonry, the roof, the walls, the foundation, reclaiming the stone and leaving a web of roots covering the whitewash and the medieval painting inside the church with an intricately woven natural code. In the Mani, the movement of stone comes to symbolize the difficulties of sustaining life. Powerful testimony to this idea is offered in a poem by the contemporary Maniot writer and ethnographer Kyriakos Kassis. Here is the poem in his own words with a cadence that, as you will hear, matches the gentle waves of the sea, and I'm very grateful to him for allowing me to record this moment. And we hope you'll hear it. Or not.
Όντα η θάλασσα ανέβη και κατάπιε τη στεριά, εμείς επάε γλιτώσαμε. Στις κορφές ανακυλώντας τις πέτρες, τις εταιριάζαμε να τις εκάνουμε σπίτι. Γενιές και γενιές σωρεύονται η μία πάνω στην άλλη.
And what you're missing is that he teared up as he was saying this, because it's this idea of moving stones is so important to people in this region. His words are translated as thus, and this is the poem written in his own hand. When the sea rose up and swallowed the land, we high up on the peaks escaped. We rolled stones over and over, matching them to each other to shape our houses. Generation after generation heaped one stone upon the other. And what you see on the screen is the best preserved village in Mani called Vathyam. The stone walls of the church bind together generations, reflecting their struggle to subsist on the land and their trust in the heavenly agents who would protect them. Now, the dedication of Ai Theodori to two powerful warrior saints, Theodore the general and Theodore the recruit, is linked to the character of the region's inhabitants, the residents of an unconquered land who have always been known for their military valor. Theodore is a common name in the Mani, a region where male infants are referred to as guns. Traces of at least one of the Theodores, or at least the head of the horse, the red section that you can just make out there, on which he once rode, can still be seen on the north wall of the church, even though it's largely obscured by a thick layer of whitewash. Below the head of the horse, you can make out incised graffiti, a sign that this was once an image of devotional importance. Yet the dedication to Theodore holds another significance, one related to the church's proximity to the village cemetery, which you see on the screen. According to the residents of Vamvaka, Ai Theodori served as the cemetery church of the village, and some even remember the existence of graves around the building, though these are no longer visible. Indeed, traces of an older cemetery can still be seen beyond the enclosure of these more recent graves and ossuaries. The church and the cemetery were and are ritually linked through rites of burial. The deceased was blessed in the church and then carried along the narrow road to the cemetery, but also through the Saturday of the Souls, a service that takes place during the first week of Lent. In this service, the martyr Saint Theodore is invoked as a protector of the deceased. But the service also recalls the miracle of Koliva, a miracle in which the military saint, seen here on the right, protected the population from the consumption of tainted food. Instead, he urged them to eat boiled wheat, the dish Koliva that is still offered in the Orthodox Church during the Saturday of Souls for the benefit of the departed. The dedication of the church signals its centrality to the community of the living and the dead. It involves the saints in issues of security through the evocation of holy protection, and it binds those baptized in the name of Theodore and their families to the saints. Thus, just as Metaxia made a vow to the saint, so did others in the village, both in medieval and, as we will see, in modern times. In 2017, the church was the site of a baptism, the first in modern memory. Because of the instability of the structure, it was held outside the church under the shade of this olive tree. The family members who were present, the father of the child, a Theodore, the godfather of the child, the son of a Theodore, and Metaxia, the child's great aunt, are linked to the saint by name, by vow, and by holy rite. This photograph, which I took during the baptism of young Kyriakos Anapliotis, manifests vows within vows, connections within connections that extend into the distant past in an unbroken line. The names Theodore, Kyriakos, and Metaxia are woven into the modern life of Ai Theodori, but their names extend backwards through the repetition within families and through sustained connections between this church and the adjacent cemetery, the annual celebration of the Saturday of the Souls, and life cycle rituals like baptisms and funerals. Yet Ai Theodori has also absorbed the names of those ancients who once walked across the same landscape, those who joined the medieval and modern residents of Vamvaka through their commemoration on the walls of the church. On the exterior of the building facing west is a Greek inscription of the 2nd century set upside down, but still legible. The letters form 3 names, Theophandi, Avi, and Epitefxi, each preceded with the word here, farewell or hail. Avi, the name to the right side, is the Greek word for dawn, and the intentional placement is a reminder of the unusual placement of the church, nestled behind a hill and only fully revealed as the sun, once risen, paradoxically, illuminates first the west side of the building. Read against the lit facade, the names in the inscription bind the viewer to the past. The names of the 3 deceased individuals are added to those recalled within the walls of the church, in the diptychs of the living and the dead, and those remembered in the nearby cemetery in commemorative prayer. In the inclusion of such an inscription, the church at Vamvaka is not unique. A similar inscription is found in this funerary church in the neighboring village of Kulumi, where the words here, erato, are displayed now in the correct orientation. The 2 inscriptions, taken from the same ancient cemetery, bound the communities to each other and to their collective past. And indeed, the 2 villages are today linked both by a road and by intermarriage. Yet the church at Vamvaka includes other ancient names, some covered up until recently, and the recently is when I actually swept the church for the baptism. This inscription I'm going to show you had disappeared until that moment. An inscribed Hellenistic stele of the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, positioned at the threshold of the sanctuary, forms part of the medieval pavement. The text records the name Philodame and ends with the word, again, here, farewell or hail. The ancient inscriptions inside and outside of the church collect the names of individuals and emphasize the word here, a word that would have resonated with the medieval Christian community. For vocalizing the word here, as medieval viewers would have done when viewing the inscriptions, would have brought to mind the repetitive use of the word in the Akathistos, a popular hymn to the Virgin chanted during successive weeks in Lent. The careful positioning of the text, visible across time, united ancient, medieval, and modern communities in a shared language of salutation and commemoration. Yet another component represented the community's past, is the panel built into the east wall of the church, which represents the entrance to an ancient temple. Here, the old decoration of a divided portal, framed by Ionic columns, is reimagined as a cross, marking the holiest side of the building. The embedding of ancient sculptural fragments in the east and west walls, as well as in the church pavement, kept the community's past in mind and in eye, uniting the residents of Vamvaka with those who had come before. In its use of ancient fragments to unite communities across time in this region, the church at Vamvaka is hardly unique. Some 20 minutes away, St. John at Keria, a 13th century dome church, also prominently displays ancient fragments. A late Hellenistic stele turned on its side and built into the west wall of the church. So if I can find, it's right here, if you can see it. Was pried from its stony matrix in 1968. And here you see a photo from before the robbery and the stele, which has now been recovered, happily. The stele is carved with pairs of male and female figures who clasp hands and stand inside an architectural framework. These men and women are identified by inscription as Kallikratidas, Gorgidas, Ophelia, Niki, together with the words Here. Kyriakos of Ancona, who described this relief and sketched it in October 1447, observed, quote, that the ancient altar was immured in the church wall for its adornment. But was it? The lowest register of the stele is carved with offering vessels, like these represented on an ancient lekithos. Turned on its side and replaced here digitally in its original position, the offering vessels border the church portal, the offerings of the ancients joining the offerings of those who prayed inside the 13th century church. A second relief of a hunter and a dog, also immured in the west wall, is today viewed as a familiar representation of a pastime still common in this region. The shared occupation of hunting unites those from the present to those of the past. The stones capture the history of a region. They keep the memory of the past alive. They signal continuities in practices and cults. Their permanence gives hope to a people who are rooted, like the plants in this facade, in a rocky landscape. And when these stones are pried from the walls in which they've been meaningfully positioned, that connection is broken. Stones in this region have a special meaning, and they carry with them the memories of the past, the ancient, and even the medieval. The walls of St. John at Keria are covered with reliefs from older Christian buildings in the areas, the dismembered screens that once protected the altars in local churches. Here, they're built into the exterior of the 13th century church, hyper-sanctifying the structure and bringing generations of worshipers into communion. This tradition of remembrance continues today as modern-day Maniots embed sculpture from their past into their churches. In recent history, buttresses were added to the south side of the Taxiarchis, the archangels at Glezu, a village close to Vamvaka. The sculptural elements, which on first glance appear to be decorative, you can see them at the very top of the buttress and the console lower down, in fact, derive from the church of Aya Marina, found through excavation in the adjacent cemetery, and I might add, unpublished and unknown to Byzantinists. On the screen, you can see the fragments built into the buttress, pieces of horizontal beams from a temple on screen, and fragments uncovered in the excavation, now stacked in the narthex of the church. The standing monument and the fallen monument are thus joined together with the marbles and memories from one transferred, or in the words of Cassis, rolled from one to the other. On the screen, you can see how close the two buildings are to one another and how easy it would be to transfer building stones for the construction of the later church and carved stones for its critical decoration. We have seen that in the church of Ai Theodori, ancient inscriptions and reliefs had made eternal the memories of those buried in close proximity to the church. But the church at Vamvaka also captured other generations that passed through the village, generations that are closer in time and united by faith, generations that gathered the stone to build the church and left their names to be remembered. Above the main portal, supporting recessed arches that would have framed at one time a painting of the church's titular saints, is a limestone beam carved with peacocks flanking a foliate cross. With its beak, one of the birds grasps a cluster of grapes that emerges from the leaves at the cross's base. The grapes and peacocks, through symbolic interpretation, are linked to the Eucharist and salvation, a link that would have been easily grasped by the faithful who were schooled in the interpretation of imagery. On the left side of this composition is an inscription written in 4 lines. In translation, it reads, "Remember, Lord, your servant Theodore the priest and his wife Kali, the builders of this holy monastery." And here I should just say that monastery in village context simply is a fancy word for church. This was always a church, not a monastery. The inscription begins and ends with the sign of a cross, which prompts the faithful to trace his or her hand from forehead to stomach and then across the chest. And the misspellings in the inscription, for those of you who can read Greek are probably horrified by the spelling, link the words actually to oral speech, signaling that it was meant to be seen and vocalized. Located on the same wall as the ancient funerary inscription, this text provides us with yet other names to associate it with the building. The name of the priest Theodore forms another connection through time, name, and profession between the saint and an individual, and then between the individual and the Theodores who pray in the church today. In the course of my study of the church, this connection between the past and present was manifested during a special service held in the building. As part of a project to create a documentary about Ai Theodori, the village priest, Father Nikos Lambrinakos, a former shepherd, you can't write that, it's perfect, typecasting, was invited to celebrate a short liturgy in the church, the first Trisaion to be held in many years. Before the service began, we took the priest around the church and read with him the words inscribed on and inside the building. He was surprised and pleased by the community that was reassembled by the written words. And I'd like to share with you a moment of the Trisaion service and then explain to you what was astonishing about it. So let's see if I can find it. Here it is.
Ελέησον ημάς ο Θεός κατ' το μεγαλεό σου, δεόμεθά σου επάκουσον και ελέησον, έτι δεόμεθα υπέρ αναπαύσεως, την δική του δούλου του Θεοδόρου, ιερέως αδερφού και συντρούγου γενομένου, Καλλιόπης, πρεσβυτέρας και νικήτας.
So in the prayer that you just heard, part of a much longer service, Father Nikos spontaneously asked the Lord to grant salvation and the remission of sins to Theodore the priest, my brother and concelebrant, Calliope his wife, and Nikitas. Suddenly, in the course of this prayer, time collapsed. As a contemporary priest and resident of the village, ritually engaged with a priest and resident of the village who had died almost a millennium earlier. For Father Nikos, there was no difference in time, and in fact, he was quite pleased to celebrate together with Theodore in spirit. In his prayer, Father Nikos calls the priest's wife Calliope, even though she's recorded as Kali in the inscription, a common name for medieval women in this region. Calliope is a modern name in the area, and in changing the name slightly, the wife of the medieval priest also was introduced into contemporary society. Now, inscriptions over the portals of churches in this region help us to repopulate villages and reimagine communities of the faithful. They inform us about the roles that these small structures played in the lives of those who built them, entered them, and prayed within them. They tell us about the motivation of church patrons for undertaking such constructions and their reasons for venerating specific saints. St. Sergius and Bacchus, a small domed 12th century church outside of Kita, a village only 15 minutes from Vamvaka by car, also incorporates, as you can see, ancient blocks into its masonry. Here, the dressed stones removed from ancient or earlier Christian buildings are woven across the surface in a cross pattern. An inscription over the main portal asks the Lord to help George from Marazi, the medieval name for the property on which the church sits, and to also help his wife and children, they who constructed this, and the adjacent church of St. George through great effort and expense. George's ability to procure and place cut stones is a sign of his effort. The hiring of a skilled mason indicates the expense. Importantly, this church was the votive offering of the family to Sergius and Bacchus, a set of warriors as powerful as the two Theodores. Within the church, the saints, and here you see Bacchus, lift up their hands in an intercessory gesture, joining their voices to the supplications of the builder, lending their heavenly power to his military prowess. Below the exterior inscription and carved into an ancient block is another, as yet unpublished, text incised into the marble. It simply states, "Lord, help your servant," the invocation of an anonymous supplicant. These inscriptions are the manifestations of vows made, marking the church exterior with the words of prayers and requests for assistance. An extraordinarily large number of such inscriptions survives in the region on the exterior of buildings like those at Vamvaka and Kita, and even on their interior, as seen in a well-known inscription at Polemitas, a neighboring village. Here, in the year 1272, a group of villagers banded together to build a church in which they would pray and around which they would be buried. In its dedication to the Archangel Michael, both functions are indicated, and for this, the villagers collected stones. This is the outside of the church, who would guess, heaping one on the other, raising a building whose exterior blended into the land, but whose interior captured heaven. Inscriptions which record the participation of large groups of people in community donations associate their names with specific hopes: health, security, and above all, salvation. On occasion, inscriptions inside the church do more than manifest the votive wishes of the faithful. The third name in the prayer recalled by Father Nikos was that of Nikitas, the marble worker, who carved the architectural sculpture at Ai Theodori and in many other churches in the region. Nikitas' traces can be found on inscriptions that bear his name and in his distinctive style of carving. On the lower side of the stone tie beam closest to the sanctuary in Vamvaka, which you see in front of you, Nikitas left a long inscription. I've already shown you the end of the text, which mentions the month and year of the church's dedication. Here at the left, the inscription begins with the word "remember," tying the text in terms of the process of memory to the inscription beginning with the word "remember" on the outside of the portal. It too begins with a cross, fusing somatic movement and vocalized prayer. And here in this inscription, the Lord is asked to remember thy servant Leo and his wife and children. The text adds yet another set of names to those already collected in the building by faith. Continuing, the text praises Leo for his great devotion, which provided these sculpted embellishments, and then instructs those standing below, "You who chant, pray on his behalf." At the end of the inscription, Nikitas identifies himself as the marble worker, the marmaras, who carried out the work by hand. The request to the chanters is found on other marbles in other churches also associated with Nikitas, the Church of St. John at Keria, where we've already seen the ancient stelae. Carved into a beam that divides the church sanctuary from the nave is the word chanters, psalondes. The letters of the word divided over two leaves rise like musical notes on a staff. In the Church of St. Theodore at Kafiona, another church dedicated to a military saint, the same word psalondes is also divided across two leaves on a beam in front of the sanctuary. These texts record for us the sounds of chant that have long since been silenced, the voices of an invisible population whose bones are now found in the ground surrounding the churches. So when Father Nikos added his voice to that of an 11th century priest, he was in fact following instructions that had been carved above his head, fulfilling a mandate made by the hand of a local sculptor. I have introduced you to figures both ancient and medieval who form part of a community assembled over centuries in the Church of Ai Theodori Vamvaka, Avi and Theophandis, Philodame, the priest Theodore and his wife, Leo and his wife and children, and of course, Nikitas the marble worker. The interest of the medieval supplicants in constructing the church was to remember through eternity the memories of themselves and their families, and to seek assistance from the saints, their principal intercessors, in entering paradise. The decoration of the church manifested this intention by creating a space that navigated between worlds that were terrestrial and heavenly. While the interior of the church at Vamvaka was originally painted, images of saints, narrative scenes from the life of Christ, and dogmatic images concerned with the incarnation and resurrection are all now covered with whitewash. In my opinion, the church has at least 2 layers of paint, a 13th century layer to which the equestrian figure of St. Theodore belongs, and an earlier layer that is no longer visible. But we should imagine that the original church looked like this: an image of Christ in the dome with scenes of his life in the vaults. At ground level, we should imagine images of saints, what we call icons, animated by prayer, represented at the same height as their human counterparts. The eyes of these saints met those of their beholders. Eye to eye, with their hands raised in reception, the saints appeared to listen to entreaties from the faithful and offer, most importantly, the promise of response. In the Mani, the name saints of the church are given importance. As in Sergius and Bacchus, they frequently find a place in the apse, where their proximity to the altar indicates the power of their intercessory prayer. At Vamvaka, as in other churches in the Mani, these holy figures are placed within a framework of natural elements, carvings drawn from the surrounding landscape and leading to the ever-blooming paradise. Close to the dome, the marble tie beams are covered with leaves and flowers, and the epistyle over the sanctuary, too, boasts decoration related to nature. Sculpture on the exterior of the church signals the connection of the two worlds, as images of foliar crosses and leaves cover panels that regulate the amount of natural light that enters into the building. The church itself acknowledges the natural world, but it transforms it into a sacred landscape. At Vamvaka, as in other Byzantine churches, this transformation is achieved in part by the careful regulation of light. The window frames diffuse the light that enters, creating otherworldly associations as one's eyes become accustomed to the hazy interior. In this and many other churches in the Mani, carved door jambs comment on this transformative nature of light. Surrounding the foliate cross, carved on the sides of the door, are 4 Greek letters that stand for a formula: the light of Christ shines over all. Placed at the entrance of the building, the formula plays on notions of light, the natural illumination that penetrates the church interior from the outside, and the bright promise of eternal light and knowledge that is shared with those within the darkened church who, once blessed, passed through the portal. Ai Theodori at Vamvaka is a humble structure, yet it exemplifies how the church building served as an agent of faith. It is a solid stone structure built, but at the same time, a portal. It was built in 1075, but it gathers within it generations from the millennium before and the millennium after. Like so many churches in the Mani, it navigates between the living and the dead. It is painted but whitewashed, solid but eroding, the church of a village, but also the church of an empire. And even so, it is one of more than 100 standing churches in the Mani that tell stories of priests, mothers, farmers, children, painters, and sculptors whose names are known, but who have never been part of a written history or art history. And this leads me to the second and shorter part of my lecture, which also concerns the Church of Ai Theodori at Vamvaka. In June 2016, I attempted 3 times to enter the church, only to find it locked. And by accident, I met one of the local councilmen, Mr. Stamatis Pandaliakis and his wife Kyriaki, who related their concerns about the church's condition. They urged me to have a look at the church, and they arranged for Metaxia to meet me with the key. And here the story begins. It was clear that Metaxia was concerned about the condition of the church. An enormous crack runs through the south wall, and a tree was growing out of it. Plants had rooted in the masonry of the roof, the walls, and the foundations. Many glazed bowls that had decorated the church exterior had been broken or pried from the masonry. Wasps had built nests onto the marble lintel of the west portal, and because of damage to the vault, and you see the enormous cracks, rain was penetrating the structure, and many of the icons had been covered with plastic in order to protect them from damage. Roots, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, had descended and continue to descend into the church. And at some point in recent memory, though this could be at any time in the last 100 years, robbers had come into the church and had dug up the floor of the narthex looking for treasure. Sculpture discovered during that illegal excavation was piled in a corner of the church. So Metaxia, Stamatis, and Kyriaki were rightfully worried, and shortly after my visit to the building, I was called by the head of the archaeological service in the region and asked to help raise funds to restore the building. And this request was based on an earlier, largely successful effort that I initiated in the Los Angeles Greek community to raise funds to restore the Church of St. Nicholas Trikambanos in Castagna-Mani. So for all the reasons I've laid out in the first part of the lecture, you can imagine why the Archaeological Service was concerned about the building. Hagia Theodori is one of the most important Byzantine churches in the region and the earliest building to have the signature of the region's famous sculptor, Nikitas. But as dire the need, the Archaeological Service has many buildings in similar condition and little funding for restoration. After careful planning, I returned to Vamvaka in 2017 to collaborate on the production of a film about the church and the community, engaging in this endeavor a colleague from Loyola Marymount University, Katerina Zacharia, whom you see here, and the documentary filmmaker Claire Andrea. We interviewed a number of residents of Vamvaka, including Dimitrios Pandaliakis, the head of one of the most important families in the village, Michalis Exarchakos, the head of a prominent family in the neighboring village of Glazou, and of course, Metaxia. Honoring the tradition of ritual lament in the Mani and connecting it to Metaxia and the church, we worked with the Byzantinist Panayotis Katsafados and Mrs. Koula Panayotopoulou, whom you see here, to create a song that would appropriately describe the efforts to save the church and Metaxia's important, and I would say solitary, role as its caretaker. And I want to share with you a short clip from that song, sung in the tradition of the region, just to hear what these laments sound like. The words that you'll hear refer to Metaxia and her vow to St. Theodore, the vow with which I began this lecture.
Βαμβάκα στα χωριά, στου Άι Θοδόρου τα στενά, στεκέται η μεταξία μας, η πιο πιστή του φύλακας, ανάβει το καντήλι του, στην εκκλησία του γλύπτη, με πλήθεια χιλιοκοσμική, μονή και καταμοναχή.
So these kinds of repetitive chants are often spontaneously created at the graveside, and it seemed an appropriate medium to capture Metaxia's role in protecting the church. Now, the film Blessings and Vows, which will be released shortly, and my ethnographic research on this church assembles the community connected to Hagia Theodori, the families of those buried in the cemetery, the family of the child baptized outside the church, Father Nikos' flock. Irini Pandaliaki Exarchakou remembers the graves that once surrounded the building. She remembers that until 1950, the church was used for funeral rites. In her words, they would bring the dead and hold the funeral service. She remembers that when she was a child, she was taken to funeral services in the church. They were all sad services, she said. They did not have coffins then, by her account, so they put the dead onto planks of wood. And if the dead person was young, there was a great lament, and the women would tear their hair, and they would carry the deceased in their arms and then to the cemetery. The whole village went to this church and then followed the procession to the cemetery. Stamatis Pandaliakis remembers his love of hunting from when he was a child. He remembers climbing up the outside of the church to ring the bell when he was 10. He remembers christenings and funeral services when he was around the age of 15. He remembers that the church has a lot of iconography, in his words, but that someone went in and painted over the saints. And he remembers that when he was 15, after seeing these services, the liturgies stopped and the church was abandoned. Michalis Exarchakos has written letter after letter to the Greek prime minister, imploring him to intervene and save this and other Byzantine churches in the region. He remembers his father telling him that robbers, foreigners, dug inside the church and stole fragments of sculpture from it. This is the community of the faithful who are connected through memory to those who built the church and those whose names are inscribed on it and in it. All of them acknowledge the importance of Saint Theodore. According to Stamatis, every family has a member named Theodore, the Anapliotis, the Pandaliakis, the Koukakis, the Yasakos, every family in the village. The church links the villagers to their past, but also to their future. For restoration of the church not only means their ability to use it again for baptisms, funerals, and for the Saturday of the Souls, but also means economic viability for the village that has grown up around it. But what about metaxia? And what about her vow? You might be thinking that. On February 13th, 2018, Metaxia Anaplioti burned to death when her house caught fire during a cold night. Following her death and in the absence of a key, Ai Theodori remained locked. It was not until June, when I arrived in Vamvaka, that the lock was cut off and I was able to enter the church. No candles had been lit in 4 months, and the interior of the church felt unnaturally still, as if it too had died. The lock from the church was buried in Metaxia's grave, and her body was covered with gravel, the stone from this harshest land that would comfort her in the next world. The church of Ai Theodori remains as it was, but now without its caretaker. Stamatis has the key for the lock and will allow people in to pray and photograph, but Metaxia's vow must now be replaced with a new one, the vow we must make to restore the church. Ladies and gentlemen, we medievalists have the luxury of standing at a distance from the material of our study, and this allows us to be dispassionate in our analysis of the art and culture of a time long past. And as I hope to have shown this evening, our understanding of medieval monuments is enriched by taking a long view, one that replaces communities of many generations in a single building, a building in which time is suspended, a building in which those who enter in faith are united with those who have come before and those who will follow. And I hope through this lecture to encourage other scholars to take an activist stance in preserving and protecting the objects of our study. We are, after all, the monument's best storytellers. May the memory of Metaxia Anaplioti be eternal, and may her church, Ai Theodori, accept the vows of those who come in faith and with honor. Thank you.
Maybe I'll go first. I was very taken by the relationship between architecture and inscription. And the question is, of course, where do you place the inscription? And of course, let's say the eternal question when we're dealing with rural community and inscription is the question of literacy. And so how architecture, inscription, and literacy play a role in the churches you work on?
Yeah, that's a great question, and as you know, I've written a lot about that. So most of the people in the 11th century wouldn't have been able to read the inscriptions. But the inscriptions, as they're written, are spelled in a way that indicates that they were dictated to somebody who simply wrote what he heard. And they have signs in them so that even if people can't read the inscriptions, they know what they are. I mean, signs of the cross or flowers or what have you. And they can make out, I think in a very rudimentary way, names are often represented larger than the rest of the inscription. And I think people, even with very little ability to read, would have been able to pick out their names in inscription. So these texts most often are found on the west side of the building when you enter, but in the Mani stones, as you've seen, move around a lot. And so even if there's an 11th century inscription, it might be replaced in another building, let's say near a window. So the inscriptions often seem to be in areas of, let's say, openness between the outer world and the inner world, or areas that are thresholds between different levels of sanctity, whether it's entering from the outside into the building or the nave into the sanctuary. So these liminal spaces in the church seem to be marked by these texts. They often, in the Mani, also are on the tie beams, so they ring from a base for the dome. So again, it's this area of transition between the space that we inhabit and the space that Christ and, let's say, the angels are perceived to be circulating above. So I think they're in very interesting places, and it's worth thinking about their position. They don't ever seem happenstance to me.
Thank you. Anyone else has questions?
I think it could be that people are so traumatized by the ending of what happened. That's what I had. I was just going to tell you, I had a call from the Mani at 2 in the morning the day I was giving a midterm to my students about the burning. And I was giving the exam and I had to interrupt the exam for the second essay question. I just said to the students, I can't stay here anymore, and this is a gift from Metaxia for you, this question, but you have to go and say a prayer for her. And I
Sorry to come down from that to something is terribly prosaic. But I'm interested in the screen and what can you tell us about it, and what parts do we know are in their original position?
Right. So in this church, so I can go back to this right here. That carved portion there, which has two griffins flanking these floral elements, are 11th century carving that's been placed, looks like, in a later screen that's been covered with cement and oil. This happens a lot in the money. The screens are made of masonry, but very small rubble stones with mortar between them, and they often fall to pieces. And so you'll often see in the later centuries that people reconstruct the screens and they'll embed the earlier stone in it to respect the original position. But what's funny is that often the inscriptions will move. They're not centered as they should be, but they'll be moved over the prophysis or the diaconicon because people really couldn't read them that well. They still appear as an epistyle. The rest of the masonry screen is filled with. But in this region, as you know, the screens are solid. They're built and they're painted on both sides usually, which I think to Byzantinists looks strange.
I was struck at the end of your lecture how you talked about, scholars tend to maintain a kind of distance from the subjects of their study. And through that, we perceive anyway that we are able to analyze with more, critical thought or dispassionately. But at the same time, I'm very struck at for you how deeply personal your engagement, not only with the church, but also with the people in the community. So I wonder, in your own sort of scholarly journey, have you found that the personal connection has actually made your analysis richer or deeper, or move in a different direction that perhaps you was unexpected for you? Or do you still try to sort of have the distant moment where you're doing analysis, and then sort of code switch to the more personal? I mean, are the lines blurred for you now?
No, I think it's a great question. There are things I can write about. I was just going to say about acoustics, but that's also become personal. Let's say about Byzantine tiles, where I feel pretty dispassionate about them as much as I like passionate about them. But for me, these rural communities have completely transformed the way I do scholarship.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difficult stance to take in a field that often holds itself apart from the modern world. But when you go to these villages, that connection is unavoidable because these are living monuments. They're not museums. They're used. There are people incising first, and then even today I was struck in the exhibition with images of ships. When you go to these churches, there are images of ships incised across the walls, or tiny images of children incised into the walls. There are living churches that continue to function in a votive way. So it would be hard, I think, in looking at this level of a community to separate from what's going on right now. And I think I do feel personally obligated to having taken so much to give back at this point.
Yes. Sharon, you control the room, please.
Oh.
Well, my question's a little bit related because I find that what you're doing with oral history is very interesting. And as something that we don't tend to use as art historians,
Right.
Thinking methodologically about bringing that into your research, how have you kind of grappled with that as kind of new territory? Like, do you have a process that you use, for example, when you talk to people, that sort of thing?
I mean, I use a kind of standard anthropological ethnographic approach. That there's a very large literature on this, on how to record people and document them, how to have them agree to have their words captured or their likenesses seen. So even for today's presentation, I need to have an agreement from everyone who I showed you that you will be seen in New York. Is it okay with you? In terms of the methodology, I think I would say there has been a little bit of pushback
curious about the nylon covering over these objects.
Yeah.
And what would be the decision making that you would take after the church, let's say, is reconstructed and the water holes are sealed through? Is this part of a life of an object that you would want to preserve, or because it serves no practical use anymore, it would be removed?
Would I preserve the nylon coverings? I mean, those are there simply because water literally pours into the church when it rains, and they're cheap supermarket bags. I think I've documented the shape of the church, and I think that when it is restored, and I hope it will be in the coming years, sooner than later, because my fear is that with an earthquake in that region, the church is not withstand it. We have everything fully documented. It will be in the film. So in terms of remembering this phase, we have it plugged in rather than displaying the nylon bags or anything. But I think the reason that they're there is important. And the reason who put them there, that it was in fact Metaxia who put everything to protect it. I will say what you're not seeing are all the icons that were destroyed by the water damage. And there was a huge discussion and decision about what to do with those. Because as you know, all the icons can't simply be thrown away. They're sacred works. So when I was in the church for the baptism and cleaned it with the grandmother of the child, that was a very lengthy debate about what to do with the destroyed icons.
I have a related question. I'm just curious how you understand the restoration project with this understanding of the long view and a living monument. How do we restore a living monument, and where do we stop?
That's a great question. There are actually standards for restorers right now of such churches, not to over-restore them. Sometimes you'll see that the outside has practically been cemented over. It's better to under-restore than to over-restore. And I think that's the philosophy taken in this region. So I should say that the restoration work is all done by the Archaeological Service or approved by the Archaeological Service. I'm not going with spray paint and fixing the walls or something. So they're pretty set standards for that.
I have a similar question, actually. I was interested in what you said about a point at which much of the church was painted over, and I was wondering if you got a sense of how these sort of aesthetic changes were made over time and who was consulted on these changes and whether or not the community voted on this sort of thing or if people just took it into their own hands.
That's a great question. Stamatis, who spoke most eloquently about that, but also Metaxia, just said that in the middle of the night somebody went in and painted over it. There's no discussion. Now, in Byzantine churches, frequently there are multiple layers of paintings. And either that's an aesthetic decision or one where there's damage to a painting and it will be overpainted to give a new, fresh image of the saint. It's the same saint over the older one, generally. I believe all the paintings are under the whitewash. Some of them are peeking through even now. And I think, so often in this region, people overpaint things with whitewash. It's a kind of mania in the region. The church on the cover of my latest book, which I have this beautiful stone church, was painted over 2 years ago with whitewash because it was to be used for a wedding, and they thought it would be nice to have a white church. So it's now, because of the elements, back to its natural color, but it was a little shocking to see. So people do things for different motivations.
Can I just ask where the church stands as a site of memory within a sort of larger economy of memory in the village? I mean, do they have strong oral traditions of other characters or priests or that people remember? And where does it fit into a larger sort of sense of memory? Because it seems to me many of the inscriptions are sort of rather accidental.
Yeah.
And don't represent specific memories, although they're the names.
So it's the names that are important and the names that they know carry down from one family to another. So for example, the baptism was the first time in 70 years that the church was used, other than us creating this Trisagion service. It was the baptism, the father of the child, who was a Theodore, wanted especially, because of the name Theodore and the connection, to have the service there. There are other churches in the village
just mentioned the degradation of the icons. There's no religious standard for what to do with them when they.
So in an icon, you're supposed to keep them and store them. You don't throw them away in the way that you don't throw glass of water away or.
But there's like a burial technique or something.
I haven't seen them buried. I think they're respectfully stored, as far as I'm aware. I will say in the case of this church, just to follow up, some of the